till I can't no more. I got the horses in the back. Horse stock is attacked.
In the coming week, G20 foreign ministers meet in Nagoya, Japan. Hong Kong holds district council elections amid heated protests, and NATO heads convene for a leaders' meeting in London. It's November 21st, 2019, and time for The World Next Week. I'm Bob McMahon.
And I'm Jim Lindsay.
Jim, the coming weekend, foreign ministers from G20 member states are going to convene in Nagoya, Japan. The meeting of G20 foreign ministers is coming after the summit of the G20, which also took place in Japan, but that was in Osaka back in June. So, Jim, what should we be watching at this particular meeting?
Well, this meeting, Bob, is an opportunity for the heads of the G20 countries to come together to discuss a variety of issues. On top of the agenda is going to be trade, issues related to Africa, the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, the G20 is considered to be the premier international organization for work on the international
because economy. It's more representative of the world's
It's more, well, it constitutes roughly 80% of the world's economy sitting around the table at these meetings. What's notable about the upcoming meeting isn't who's going to be there, but who's not going to be there. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is not going to be at the meeting. The State Department attributes this to the fact that he's attending the NATO foreign ministers meeting, which actually happened yesterday. However, he's not making the trip, though several of the European foreign ministers are, the G20 meeting. This sort of got a lot of tongues wagging about what this signals. I think there's been a fair amount of criticism, arguing that, well, it's nice that the Deputy Secretary of State, John Sullivan, is going, given the importance of the G20, and particularly given the importance the United States has placed on confronting predatory Chinese economic practices. This is a place where the Secretary of State should be showing up because the Chinese will be there. And there are a whole lot of issues going on the international economic front. But as we discussed on last week's podcast, also a variety of political military issues that involve
Which, by the
America's,
way, really percolated after that podcast.
They most certainly will. Why don't we talk about them? Which one sort of stands out to you, Bob?
The burden-sharing discussion, Jim, I think in particular.
Did it go well?
It did not go particularly well. It continues to unravel and contribute to what seemed to be wild speculation about U.S. troop levels and everything else in the region. So it's a wild time in Northeast Asia.
Yeah, we should put on the table for people who didn't listen to last week's podcast. The United States came in and has asked the South Koreans to pay roughly $5 billion toward troop support annually. That's a five-fold increase. And the South Koreans have bristled at it, arguing that it's an outrageous set of demands. They have their own demands in return. American delegates apparently got up and walked out of a meeting, which added further tension in the relationship. So this is going to be something to watch. The South Koreans reached an agreement with the Chinese on cooperation, which a lot of people are sort of arguing about how significant that is, whether that's sort of a reminder to the United States that South Korea has other options. So it's a very sort of interesting thing to follow. Likewise, we're sitting here now a day before the so-called GSOMIA, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, is set to expire between Japan and South Korea. One would have expected if the Secretary of State were in Nagoya, he would have an opportunity to try to bring the two sides together. It's not clear the South Koreans and the Japanese are going to come together on this issue. I think for a lot of American foreign policy experts, I think for the American military establishment, the fact that two treaty allies are going to sort of let this agreement of sharing military information lapse is a great concern.
Yeah, as you said, back to your original point, Jim, for the U.S. to not be present, and it just percolates through so many other things.
I want to be clear. The United States will be present. There will be U.S. officials there, but again, we're not coming in with sort of the foreign minister, the Secretary of State. And in diplomacy, as in much of life, people read things into whether you come to events they care about. And if you don't show up, they take it as a signal, I think, that you are not as invested as you might think you are. And so I think there's been a lot of commentary over that.
And we'll be talking some more about it, but it's also coming at a time amidst another crucial juncture seemingly in the U.S.-China trade talks, and one would have thought there would be an effort to get those dealt with at this type of meeting too.
Right. And I would note that Secretary Pompeo would argue, well, when it comes to the specific issue of the negotiations on trade, that's not really in my portfolio.
True.
That's handled more by Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, perhaps a little bit Wilbur Ross, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Treasury. Steve Mnuchin is also involved, people in the White House. However, these are issues that can spill over and aren't sort of neatly contained. It's not as if trade issues sort of sit in one little box and have nothing to do with political, military issues. So I think there's going to be a lot of commentary about this going forward. But while we're in Asia, Bob, why don't we talk a bit about the situation in Hong Kong, a topic I think that may come up on the margins of the G20 foreign ministers meetings. As you know, the protests in Hong Kong have been going on for more than 5 months now, almost 6 months. They began peacefully, but recently they have taken a turn toward violence. The protests have taken over the streets. Riot police have stormed the campus of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And as all this is happening, Hong Kong is set to hold so-called district council elections this coming Sunday. So where do we think we're going here, Bob?
Well, let's start with the university protests. So it was the Polytechnic University became the focal point. I think there were several universities where there were protests and protesters attacking authorities, police forces, and so forth. The ones that got the most attention by far were at the Polytechnic University. Now parts of it are in ruins because the Chinese broke the protest. At latest report, there were little straggler bits of students here and there, but most of them have been, as they say, processed by Chinese authorities, and there's sort of cleanup going underway. But they were quite dramatic. There was several days of sort of siege-like activity with Molotov cocktails being lobbed at police vehicles and so forth.
So this is from the protesters,
this
or
is
at least
from the protesters.
A section of the protesters.
That's right. And we should say these protests, you mentioned 5 months and counting, they have this pop-up aspect to them where, one weekend it's at an airport, another weekend it's in a metro, another weekend it's in some busy streets. This one, the latest manifestation was in these universities. They are ongoing. They remain sort of remarkable in that they remain leaderless, and yet there is this sustained aspect to them, again, kicked off by the Chinese attempt to push through this extradition bill through the local legislature that China controls. That bill was removed, actually withdrawn completely, but late in the game, there are other demands that are seen as non-starters by the Chinese in terms of...
Yeah, they come with like 5 demands.
Five main demands are the ones that we've seen quoted most recently. On top of it all, Jim, is something known as the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which sailed through the U.S. Congress this week, overwhelmingly in both the House and Senate.
It's headed to President Trump's desk as we speak.
And let me just state, during a week of impeachment inquiry hearings, extremely partisan, you had overwhelmingly bipartisan votes for this act. Actually, the 2 separate bills. The one that's getting most attention has to do with requiring the U.S. to review on an annual basis the autonomy of Hong Kong to make sure to verify that still has this separate legal and political system such that the U.S. will continue to accord it special trading rights and so forth, which are crucial.
I think it's important to keep in mind that Hong Kong, given the accession agreement, which Britain returned Hong Kong to China. Hong Kong was operated under special rules for 50 years. Hong Kong, obviously a major financial center, and the agreements we have with them are predicated on the notion that Hong Kong will enjoy that special status. And so this is an attempt to say, have those rules change? If they do, the economic privileges that Hong Kong is accorded go away. That would be a significant blow to the Hong Kong economy if that were to happen.
Absolutely. And perhaps even, let's say, enraging the mainland authorities more is the human rights component of this legislation, which is if individuals are found to have been abusing the human rights of anyone in Hong Kong, not just citizens, but people who happen to be physically in Hong Kong, they can be targeted for sanctions. And we talked in the previous podcast about the Magnitsky Act, those sanctions. This would be sort of a similar type of sanction where individuals found to have abused human rights, authorities may be authorizing some crackdown in an area where truncheons were used to beat up students or whatever. That could potentially involve sanctions against individual travel sanctions, banking sanctions, you name it. China has immediately reacted to this legislation passing by calling it a grave violation of its sovereignty and issuing warning after warning. It dominated Chinese newscasts in the past day or so. And yet the latest reports say that President Trump looks like he's going to sign this, but we'll have to see. It comes in the middle again, as we talked about these trade negotiations. They don't happen in a vacuum. So
right.
it's
Well, again, there's linkages. These issues cross space, and that's important.
And that was going to be a skinny trade deal anyway, is what they call a skinny trade deal in any event, Jim. But,
Well, but that's the trade deal that was concluded back in October that seems not to have been concluded.
Right.
And sort of the deadline for actually agreeing on the details keeps getting pushed into the future. And it would not surprise me that if the president signs it, that the Chinese carry through on their threats, that they're going to retaliate. And I would imagine they might even take a tougher line on this trade deal. So we'll see how that goes. This again gets us back to the issue of Secretary of State Pompeo's absence from the G20 summit, because one could imagine this could be a conversation you could have with your Chinese counterpart on the margins of the meeting, that perhaps maybe that's the reason not to go. This sort of signal a little bit of toughness. I'm not really sure what's influenced the secretary's travel schedule.
And then we've got the backdrop to all of this being, you referenced the district council elections. So I think they're going to be closely watched for what sort of candidates emerge as favored and which way they lean towards, sort of more independence or pro-mainland or whatever.
You're exactly right, Bob. When you sort of look at the Hong Kong political structure, Hong Kong has 18 districts, and these elections that are scheduled for Sunday, there's a lot of speculation they may not come off. These elections elect about 452 seats. It's not at all clear to me that the people who hold these seats exercise significant authority in terms of...
But they are directly elected.
Exactly right. And traditionally, these seats have been won by people who lean toward Beijing. So the question is, will we get a different outcome in Sunday's election? So I would imagine people are going to be going through the election returns, trying to sort of see how they deviate from ones in the past. We had the last of these district council elections back in 2015. They're held every 4 years. And again, pro-establishment, pro-Chinese parties tend to win, but that may not be the case here. And again, I think one of the hardest things for us to get a sense on right now about the mood in Hong Kong is whether the bulk of the population is still committed to the protests given the turn toward violence. Again, these protests began peacefully, and the size of the protest turnout was phenomenal.
Right. This is about, 7 million people in Hong Kong? There was one that had almost 1 million people estimated.
What we don't have a good sense is where the average Hong Konger stands on this, and it's going to be interesting to see. There's been a lot of speculation about mainland China intervening in Hong Kong to end the protests. There are a variety of reasons why the Chinese might not want to do that, most notably because, as we discussed, the potential that it could end up ruining the Hong Kong economy as other countries react, particularly if we get something that looks like Tiananmen Square 30 years later. However, it's not clear how long the government of Xi Jinping can tolerate these protests. And this is where you get people speculating, is there a potential contagion effect? Do people on the mainland look to Hong Kong, what news reports they get, makes them a little bit more unhappy with their lack of voice in decisions made in mainland China? Does that metastasize? Does it spread? Others say that concern is exaggerated and the Chinese aren't especially worried about it. But obviously in these situations where events are fluid, small developments could have big ramifications down the road.
Well, Jim, I want to cast our gaze a little bit more into the futures, let's say beyond Thanksgiving next week.
We should note we're not going to be releasing a podcast next Thursday because it is Thanksgiving here in the United States, and both of us are going to be with our family eating turkey or something else.
Studiously avoiding the news, we hope.
I'm going to turn my phone off.
But NATO is planning for a meeting that takes place. It's, as we discussed at the outset, it's called a leaders meeting. It's going to be in London, December 3rd and 4th. According to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the meeting is going to focus on, quote, ensuring NATO continues to adapt in order to keep its population of almost 1 billion people safe. So that's a tall order, it seems like. Jim, what do we know about this meeting?
Two things are remarkable about this meeting, Bob. One is when it's happening, and second is what it's called. Let me talk about the first. This is the year that NATO celebrated its 70th anniversary. That was back in April. One would have thought, when you're marking the 70th anniversary of the most successful military alliance in world history, and indeed the most successful multilateral organization in world history, that leaders would turn out to mark that day. But there was a great deal of reluctance to do so. It would have been the United States' turn to host, and there was concern that President Trump wouldn't be fully on board. Second thing is this is not a summit. This is a leaders meeting. Now, I think to most people, you go, what's the difference between the two? I will tell you, in the world of diplomacy, there's a big difference. I happened to be in Paris over the weekend. I was with an official from NATO who went on at a dinner speech at great length about the fact that this was a leaders meeting. And the main difference is you don't have to issue a communique after a leaders meeting. A summit generally is followed by a communique.
So that pressure is off the table.
And there's a challenge, obviously, right now in the transatlantic alliance about coming to agreement on a communique. We saw that if you go back to the NATO meeting back in Canada, 18 months ago, where there was a communique, and then Prime Minister Trudeau gave a press conference that President Trump, who had already left the premises, took issue with and disputed the communique. So this leaders meeting is some sense to take a little bit of the stress off. President Trump will be there. And I think one of the big questions is, what's the tenor of the meeting going to be? We've talked about this a lot. President Trump has been at times quite critical of NATO, famously saying on the campaign trail he thought it was obsolete, talked an awful lot about how he sees European allies not spending enough on defense. On the other hand, he has taken credit for the fact that in recent years, European countries, or at least some European countries, or European members of NATO, have spent more on defense. So the question is, what's going to be sort of the mood at this meeting? And again, the backdrop to this is the interview that French President Emmanuel Macron gave to The Economist, in which he talked about NATO experiencing brain death. Now, that got a lot of pushback in Europe, particularly from the Germans. But clearly there is a great deal of skepticism in Europe about the health of the transatlantic alliance, and particularly America's commitment and interest in Europe. The phrase I keep seeing these days is how America is untethering itself from Europe. Now, I don't think that's actually the case, and you certainly don't see it in public opinion polls, and you don't see it if you go up to Capitol Hill. You talked about the bipartisan support for tough line against China. Likewise, it's pretty clear there's bipartisan support for the transatlantic relationship, for NATO, skepticism toward Russia. So I think the talk of how America is leaving Europe behind is overstated, but there's a reality in political world where people keep talking about things being true, they can become true, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think we've established a theme a bit on this podcast this week, Jim, of sort of the shakiness of U.S. multilateral relations, I guess. And It's going to be surely tested as we get into the waning weeks of this year.
I think there are going to be a few specific issues the leaders will get into. There's talk about approving what would become the fifth domain of NATO interest. NATO has a land domain, sea domain, air domain, cyber domain, and now there's talk about adding space as a domain. In essence, an area of concern that NATO should focus its attention on, build its capacity, and increase its coordination. But you're also going to get talk about counterterrorism, obviously going to be talk about Russia and how to approach Russia. One of the things that President Macron raised in his interview in The Economist is rethinking relations with Russia, that we can't simply keep going down the punitive road. That is not going to lead us where we need to go. It's going to be a big issue of Turkey's invasion of northeastern Syria. There's going to be discussion partly because Turkey is a NATO member, but also because, going back to the Trump administration, a great deal of unhappiness that President Trump announced the decision the way he did. He simply announced it, no heads up to anybody. Other countries, particularly I think the French and the British, have military assets there, and so they were just taken aback that there was absolutely no attempt at coordination. Again, that's one of the issues that President Macron raises in his sort of critique of NATO and the transatlantic relationship. And again, I assume the president will say something about how well or poorly the European members of NATO are at fulfilling the 2014 Wales Summit pledge to get their defense spending up to 2% of GDP by 2024. The only question is whether the president is going to focus on the fact that European countries are spending more and he deserves credit for it, or whether he's going to focus on the fact that many of them are still far away from reaching that standard, particularly the Germans. deficits, who I think right now are about 1.25% of GDP, and they'll be lucky to get to 1.5% by the year 2024.
Yeah, I would add just one other thing, which is you mentioned Syria, and that whole situation unspooled a bit, although I should add there are still U.S. troops now guarding oil fields, among other things, in northern Syria. But President Trump spoke pretty derisively of U.S. allies in Europe about taking back, ISIS prisoners to their own country and just sort of not stepping up and playing a role and settling that situation when it was raised about, what about the threat of a resurgent ISIS. So there's other issues like that could come to the fore as well.
Bob, let's shift gears and talk about our figures of the week. This week's figure, which comes to us by our Twitter poll, is hundreds killed in Iran. Bob, why the audience select this figure?
I think the figure points to the casualty toll that's still to be confirmed, but it appears to be credible, resulting from rather unexpected and quickly escalating demonstrations that emerged last weekend in Iran. So we've been talking week after week about demonstrations around the world, including in the Middle East. Iran had not been among those countries until last weekend. And the trigger was, as in so many other cases, an economic one. In this case, the government removing subsidies for fuel. On the surface, it didn't seem like a lot of money per liter or whatever it was, but it adds up especially to struggling Iranians, of which there are many right now, and they have become accustomed to fuel subsidies, among other things. So the response was immediate. There were traffic jams and all sorts of demonstrations involving vehicles blocking roadways and other things, and it quickly escalated into anti-government and anti-supreme leader, I may note, demonstrations, and not just in Tehran or a handful of other big cities across the country. The death toll that generated the figure of the week, I think, derives from an Amnesty International estimate that, or a documentation actually, of at least 106 deaths in 21 cities across the country. There have been other reports of the death toll as high as 200. On top of it was the vehemence of the government crackdown, I think also points to how serious the government took this and how serious the concern is about this being a different type of anti-government uprising. They took the internet offline. Very severe step. I'm not sure if it's actually been restored yet in the country, Jim. And to the extent there was footage that still leaked out of the country, it was security forces using live ammunition to break up protests, and that's where those death toll figures came through. As it has often done in the past, the government, in what seems to be putting down or quelling the major parts of this uprising, accused foreign elements of fomenting it. Said they have achieved, I think President Rouhani called it historic victory against their foes, and so trying to put them on a footing of us against them as opposed to us against us. The government is saying it has won this day, but they clearly have some work to do to try to sort out their internal problems. Our colleague Ray Takei has talked a lot about the hardliners in the Iranian regime wanting to set up a so-called resistance economy against the sanctions that the U.S. has ratcheted up in recent months. This was part of that effort. If anything, it's going to be a tough road, whether or not these demonstrations are actually over or not, but even if they are, I think the government has got a tough road ahead.
Yeah, well, just getting back to the issue of the maximum pressure strategy of the Trump administration, certainly proponents of that strategy, Ray being one of them, would argue that this is how you would expect it to manifest itself. You squeeze the economy, it hurts the Iranians. They have to take steps like cutting fuel subsidies because they can't afford them anymore because of the U.S. pressure, that leads to a political backlash and it's going to compel the regime to concede to the Trump administration. That's the logic. The question we have right now, it's a big question mark. Will it actually play out that way? Because one way it could play out, as you point out, is that the government simply just cracks down severely on public protests and is able to contain that protest, and it doesn't lead to the next step, which is a change in policy. But again, big question mark. Got predictions on both sides of that debate, and we'll see how it unfolds.
And thanks again to our Twitter followers for helping generate that discussion. Jim, who or what is your figure of the week?
Bob, I'm going to go with a number, and my number is 41. And that refers to the length of time between a 1978 State Department decision on the status of Israel's settlements in the West Bank and a decision this week by the Trump administration. Back in 1978, Jimmy Carter was president. The State Department issued a decision saying that Israel's settlements in the West Bank were illegal, violated international law. The Carter administration was the only U.S. administration to take that particular position. Subsequent administrations basically said they found the settlements unhelpful, or to borrow the phrase that President Obama would use, illegitimate. This past week, the Trump administration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, ago, announced that as far as the Trump administration is concerned, Israel's West Bank settlements do not violate international law. This was a significant ruling. I will note that a number of international bodies disagree wholeheartedly. And so this is sort of touched off yet again this question of America's broader commitment to international law, to multilateralism, and also the specific thing of, is the two-state solution in the Middle East coming to an end? And you got to note there are, I think, something on the order of 130 government-approved settlements in the West Bank, maybe another 130 or so that are informal, that aren't necessarily with the approval of the Israeli government. And, the argument is that the settlement policy is essentially making it impossible to have a Palestinian state at any point in time, because it simply won't have the natural sort of boundaries and spread to be able to succeed. Now, I will tell you, on the merits of the issue, you can get lawyers to argue back and forth over whether or not the traditional rulings from a variety of international bodies are dispositive, that is, end the question or not. And I will spare our listeners the multitude of arguments pro and con on all of that. But it does sort of raise, I think, this fundamental question of, where is the Middle East peace process going to go? Is there one we can even begin to speak about?
Yeah, it's occurring at a curious time. There's all sorts of speculation about why this decision came out. Israel's in the process of trying to, and failing so far, to put together a government.
Looks like they're going to have a third set of elections, because Benny Gantz failed to put a government together.
So Benny Gantz, who, along with Bibi Netanyahu, both greeted the decision by the United States, actually, on the West Bank settlements, still was unable to put together a critical mass of parties to be able to govern the country. So it could be going right back to the polls, and there's no sign that's going to lead to any further breakthrough, unless this is a country where one or two seats could spell the difference. So maybe some furious horse trading going on before this next round.
Yeah, we will see what is going to happen sort of internally with Israeli domestic politics. But you're quite right. This decision was applauded by people across the political spectrum in Israel, so it's not necessarily divisive there. I think that the bigger question sort of going forward is, have we effectively come to the end of the two-state solution? Here I'll actually just flag the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, which has, I think, three really good pieces on this topic. They take different points of view. One is from Martin Indyk, who's a fellow here at CFR and was twice U.S. ambassador to Israel, talking about how the Trump administration's policy is endangering prospects for peace. Another piece by Mike Duran, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, who argues that the two-state solution has been dead for quite some time, and it's about time we sort of recognize that. And another piece by a gentleman whose name is now escaping me, arguing that you were never going to make a two-state solution work, and that we really need to think about how you can have a one-state solution
where there's some sort of equal status of
and
Palestinians.
provides for the democratic rights of both Jewish Israelis and Arabs as well. So this is a very complicated question. It's been coming up a fair amount on the campaign trail, certainly on the Democratic primaries. And so I think it's a really interesting issue to watch and see how it develops.
Yeah, and it's very thought-provoking. You're right. It's a great issue on those articles, and there's also the broader Middle East coverage in that issue is food for thought on not only what's happening there, but what the U.S. role can and should be, and whether it matters even. Like you mentioned, 41 years since that State Department ruling, and in that time, probably hundreds of thousands of Israelis have basically taken up.
Yes, I think it's like 700,000 Israelis.
Overall, 700,000.
So and again, I want to, we do a podcast, we talk about issues in 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. This is a very complicated issue with lots of arguments and counter arguments, long history. But I think we may be at a turning point where we're going to have to rethink sort of what it is that U.S. policy is seeking to accomplish and can accomplish. But what about you, Bob? What is your figure of the week?
Jim, I'm going to take liberties, as I sometimes do, and choose as my figure a panda.
A panda.
And the panda's name is Bei, spelled BEI-BEI. And Bei was born at National Zoo in Washington, run by the Smithsonian, and is part of China's panda diplomacy. But Bei is going back. Actually, he has gone back this week to China, to Chengdu, where China runs this facility to help reintegrate pandas back into a sort of a bigger habitat. Is Bei going
back willingly, or did he misbehave
Unclear.
and is being exiled?
Unclear. He seemed to be fine. He was well stocked with bamboo shoots and so forth in his FedEx jet that he took back.
Went by FedEx. Well,
and I mention him not only because I like pandas, because I do.
They are really remarkable animals.
And they are, we should note, the symbol of the World Wildlife Federation, among other things. Pandas are actually one of the world's, so far, success stories in terms of reviving surviving an endangered species. They're no longer technically endangered. They are listed as vulnerable. So they're not out of the woods yet, pardon the pun. They're not out of the bamboo woods yet. But their numbers have come back to such a degree, in part because of this, what they call panda diplomacy of China, that in some ways was triggered by the U.S.-China normalization relations in the early 70s, which is when, I believe was when that first occurred. Pat Nixon was enamored of pandas, the story goes, and China responded by actually sending 2 pandas to live in the U.S., not on loan, but to live. Yep. Since then, they have started this process of these loner pandas, and in some cases to try to breed in foreign zoos. And there's been mixed record, but it has happened. Beibei became a darling of Washingtonians in particular because National Zoo created these sort of special cameras. You can watch Beibei sort of growing up from a little peanut to what we see as thriving.
Small when they're
absolutely
born.
Tiny, which is part of the challenge. It's tough to breed pandas, and then once they are born, to get them to survive in captivity. Beibei did thrive. We had all sorts of incredible photos and videos of Beibei frolicking in the snow and so forth. So it really touched a chord for all Washingtonians in these partisan times, Jim. Pandas, I think, broke down those walls. And there have been other such initiatives in U.S. zoos and in zoos across the world. And so I mention this just to say that, in the midst of all the tough things going on the trade front and other ways between countries, there is soft diplomacy occurring, and it sometimes has an impact. And so the story of Beibei should be one to give a little bit of hope.
So is a replacement to Beibei on the FedEx plane back to the
Actually, that's an excellent
Zoo?
question. And I have not been able to confirm that or not. I've been looking around on some of the reports to see whether that is going to happen. I don't have any reason to believe not. That won't happen. If any of our listeners can confirm that, I'd be happy to hear. But it has been a successful relationship. And it's one, by the way, that at the end of the day, the Smithsonian, according to the reports I've read, it's not cashing in on this. And in fact, it has spent several $1 million to support this program of its own. Yep. But for the greater good of prolonging the panda species, basically. And so one imagines it's going to continue, but I'd like to see confirmation of that. But Beibei is back in Chengdu. And that's our look at the world next week. Here's some other stories to keep an eye on. A second round of presidential elections are being held in Afghanistan. And Bulgaria's Prime Minister, Boyko Borisov, visits the White House.
Please subscribe to The World Next Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And leave us a review while you're at it. They help us get noticed and improve the show. Please note that opinions expressed in The World Next Week are solely those of the hosts or our guests, not a CFR, which takes no institutional positions. Today's program is produced by Zoe Collis with senior producer Jeremy Sherlick. Special thanks to Anna Shortridge and Caroline Cantus for their assistance. And this week, our recording engineer was Charles Tolbert. Our theme music is provided by Miguel Herrero and licensed under Creative Commons.
We're taking next week off to celebrate the Thanksgiving holiday here in the U.S., but we'll be back with a new episode of The World Next Week on Thursday, December the 5th.
This is Jim Lindsay saying goodbye.
And this is Bob McMahon saying so long, or Beibei.